Necessity is the mother of all invention, and while battlemechs were no longer unique innovations in and of themselves after the 25th century, by the end of the First Succession War, desperate situations were unfolding across the Inner Sphere due to the Great Powers' hunger for war machines to fill the lines of their ever-dwindling armies, and to do so with ever-declining production capacity. Across human space, substitutes, half-measures, and improvisations were put into place to plug the holes in every one of the Great House's military-industrial complexes. Multiple nations tried their best to create new, sustainable platforms that could weather the intensity of these new wars. In other words, they were now making attritional assets that could be more easily replaced in the high-casualty environments they were being sent into. A key example of this can be seen within the depths of the scorned nation of the Federated Suns. These aggressors conceived and assembled their Centurion, a mockery of design and practicality, in order to fulfill such a role within the armed forces of the Federated Suns. Across the Inner Sphere, a laughable attempt was put forward by the misguided fools and criminals of the Free Worlds League in their own simplified workhorse, and this took on the form of the Hermes 2 series. Both were absolute disappointments, as you'd expect from such barbarous people, at least in comparison to that which was crafted inside of a house of wisdom and true spiritual guidance. In the wake of the atrocities committed against the Capellan Confederation, its people, and the glorious Capellan Confederation armed forces, the nation and its people would take on the concept behind these two enemy nations and make it their own. Through brilliance which could only be found in their struggle for survival and prosperity, the Confederation refined the idea of the standardized trooper medium mech to its natural conclusion. Celestial wisdom, naturally, guided the way into this military and industrial endeavor, as it does with all things. Through this divine wisdom would flow action. Through action, perhaps the most efficient medium mech in the history of the Inner Sphere would be born. Through its birth, it would save the nation forged by House Liao, and one day allow it to not only survive, but to become the mightiest house within the entirety of the Inner Sphere, a place which it was always destined to occupy. Thankfully, the Celestial Wisdom's knowledge is vast, as is its ability to peer into the perilous future. Even in the darkest of days, House Liao will always be prepared for the arrival of the glorious dawn of their future. And one day, all shall share within the prosperity and warmth it offers. In this dedicated piece, we are going to examine the greatest enforcer of the Chancellor's celestially inspired will, the very backbone of an army that persevered through a poverty of equipment like no other. But because of this one mech's reliability, flexibility, and availability, it was able to become an iconic battlemech beyond anything anyone else could deploy, ton for ton, within its primary development era. With time, the development of this mech would vindicate the Capellan Confederation of any arguments of poor military stewardship, in its own way even, at least throughout the mech's true golden era. So, without further delay, let us look at the ultimate tool of Kara's metal industries, and the Celestial Wisdom. The Vindicator. Instead of bullying the Free Worlds League into submission, Barber Liao's calculated atrocity nurtured the latent hatred the League had always harbored towards the Confederation. The citizens of Outreach, Ingersoll, and New Canton ultimately paid the price for their Chancellor's hubris. An excerpt from Barber Liao, Chancellor of Doom, by Jackson Hughes, Endurian Free Press, 2804. The death of the Star League at the hands of Stefan Amaris sent a ripple throughout the territories governed by humanity. Amaris, who had killed most of the royal family that had once ruled the Terran hegemony, with notable exceptions like the Windsor-Camerons and the Cameron-Jones branches of the family, had broken the kingdom at the core of the Inner Sphere and likely himself had no idea of what he'd fully unleashed. The Lords of the Star League, barring House Cameron, had all been increasingly looking for a way to exit the oppressive supranational system. The SLDF, paired with its greatest supplier, the hegemony, had become their primary obstacle to any move to see any individual house break with the central government. Well, the SLDF was now impossible to keep in the field due to the destruction of much of the hegemony's industries, and on top of that, had been badly mauled while fighting Amaris and his armies. What happens when the only things keeping everything from falling into madness break down all at once? The answer to that is found first in the dissolution of the Star League, as the Great Lords themselves opted to break their bonds to one another in August of 2781. Sadly, though, things didn't end with just that. Tensions had been building between the various member states of the League for generations, if not all the way back into the Age of War. Now scores were to be settled. 5 years after the Council's dissolution, Minoru Kurita declared himself First Lord of the Star League, and the Succession Wars began. Every major power suffered in this nightmare-made reality, even if all of them had to some degree desired it. House Liao was in a more than compromised position. Its overall territories were smaller than that of its neighbors. Its industrial power was also lesser, and it bordered both the Free Worlds League and Federated Suns, the pair of traditionally aggressive and expansionist powers which had, during the Age of War, sought to destroy their state multiple times, and had nearly succeeded in their vicious objective. In order to best secure itself as the fighting opened, Barber Liao, the Chancellor of the Capellan Confederation, aggressively tore into the remnants of the Terran hegemony, looking to feast upon the corpse of the functionally dead interstellar power in order to best position itself for the protracted conflict to come. This move had an unfortunate reaction early on, with the CCAF coming to blows with the much more heavily armed DCMS across multiple worlds, where the Confederation would be turned back across several potentially vital gains. The response to this setback, and other looming reversals, concluded in a major policy change on Cyan. Commanders, henceforth you may consider the Ares Conventions suspended. I expect you all to act accordingly. Chancellor Barber Liao, 2789. Unfortunately for the Capellan Confederation, shortly thereafter, the Free Worlds League proved to be a much more dangerous adversary than the hegemony. Due to the power imbalance between the two states, the Confederation, the originators of the Ares Conventions, discarded them in favor of using far more ruthless tactics and strategies, attempting often to terrorize their Marik opponents at every level. Ruthless actions were taken, and at first, they seemed to be successful even. This stratagem was born of a desire to defend their homes from their hated enemies abroad, and because of House Liao's relative weakness as compared to their larger neighbors, This strategy, it would turn out, was an error. The League, in reprisal to this horrifying campaign launched against their military and civilians, tore into the Confederation, and used the same restricted methods in response, including the once unjustifiable use of strategic nuclear weaponry, orbital bombardments, and the act of destroying major industrial and civilian centers. The savagery of the League's response went so far as to cripple major industrial regions along their shared border, costing the Confederation one of their precious and irreplaceable manufacturers for assault mechs, it would seem. By the end of the Celestial Wisdom's campaign here, massive losses had been incurred through underestimating their opponent's willingness to fight, and only with the help of the 21st Centaurian Lancers, after her campaign had begun, would the bleeding be staunched against their Marik enemies. By 2795, Barbara Liao had died of a rare blood disorder. Tragically for her family and the nation, her two primary heirs had been killed on Callaway by the Free Worlds League military, and her granddaughter was too young to inherit the throne either. The title of Chancellor fell to a non-Liao for the last time in the Confederation's history. One Sadal Quinn, the Duke of Sirius and Prefect of Tikhonov, was now the ruler of the Capellan state, at least for that moment. He would stabilize the situation for House Liao, before handing power peacefully over to Ilsa Liao in 2801. Ilsa attempted to secure some form of peace with House Davion, even going so far as to offer to support the Davion's claim to the throne of the First Lordship of the Star League. This, sadly, ended catastrophically as the Federated Sons rejected this proposal by launching a dedicated military campaign against the Capellan state and its people. More planets were lost, and another disaster unfolded for the followers of Celestial Wisdom. By 2821, the First Succession War ground to a halt, as all those who participated simply became too exhausted to continue the fighting. And House Liao was perhaps the most exhausted of all. The underlying causes, though, tragically, had not vanished with this cessation of hostilities. Wounded as House Liao now was, a radical approach was required to secure its future, and Chancellor Ilsa Liao spearheaded this with her far-sighted vision for what the nation needed in order to survive. They needed to reorganize their armed forces, but more importantly, they needed robust, reliable, and generalized machines to fill their depleted weapons inventories. The industrial limitations of the Confederation were becoming clear at this time as well, especially in the wake of the First Succession War. That reality also added an additional criteria to the mix for their new generalized machines. In essence, they needed a mech that was easy to produce, as to not ask more of the Confederation than it could provide. It could fill as many roles in a mainline capacity as possible. The direction provided by the Celestial Wisdom was to be followed and brought into reality by the more than reliable Kara's Metal Industries. With so many requirements placed upon it, the new design put forward by Kara's was of course a compromise. It was light enough to still be a medium mech, and thus did not strain the Confederation's already struggling war industries too terribly. It was intended to be sufficiently gunned to take on most other medium mechs one-on-one, but its firepower was not to be anything to write home about. The new object had excellent armored protection for its weight, allowing it to potentially briefly fill in the role of a heavy mech where possible, or to slow enemy advances, or to allow it to work with non-mech forces to bring down targets. And finally, the mech sourced easily manufactured components in large numbers. In other words, this vital mech met the basic precondition that it was to be cheap to build. The mech that came of this initiative and embodied all of these traits was to be a mech that became so closely tied to House Liao that the two had been interlinked indefinitely. This, of course, was the legendary Vindicator. This new war machine, for its intended purpose, was so well engineered that only one alteration was made in the design from its initial stage of development. That being that the VND-1X was forced to discard its onboard machine gun, which was made by a Kara's subsidiary, in order to adopt a Hessen small laser, an alternative manufacturer's component. This was done in the name of stimulating the domestic economy of the Confederation, and not just giving only handouts to one manufacturer. This small pivot in and of itself was truthfully a snub of the central government though, as the true goals behind this edict were ignored. The real nature of the decree handed down to Karis had hoped that a far more major component would be the one sourced, rather than merely a small laser. But the situation was dire within the Inner Sphere politically, thus the slight was ignored, and shortly thereafter, the VND-1R, the primary Succession Wars example of the Battlemech, came to life. The mech was, from this point forward, to be the staple which the Capellans leaned into with every struggle it faced. In fact, one could argue the realm of celestial wisdom only survived the second, third, and perhaps even the fourth Succession Wars due to this one mech's versatility. Whenever its frontline mech forces lost a major, irreplaceable machine, such as when they lost the ability to manufacture their traditional high-intensity battlefield assets, for example mechs like the Thunderbolt, it was the Vindicator that permanently filled the gap. Not as a one-to-one replacement, of course, as the V&D series was 20 tons lighter than this staple. No, this situation meant that instead of 2 Thunderbolts being found in a company, over time there would be 4 Vindicators. The low cost of these Vindicators ensured that they were always available. They could always be built in numbers. They could always be found to draw upon. Quantity is in fact a quality all its own, it turns out. This military doctrine does have some drawbacks though, and as Capellan performance during the Succession Wars proved, against a well-equipped, well-led, tactically flexible enemy, the forces of the Capellan Confederation, and their Vindicators, when confronted, could be put into critical conditions. As it would turn out, the celestial wisdom which guided the Capellan people had proven true again when Liao prepared her nation and war-making industries for a grim future. Because in 2828, only a handful of years after Vindicator production began, the Second Succession War exploded, throwing the Inner Sphere back into turmoil, decline, destruction, and bloodshed. This carnage-laden tragedy was the backdrop to the Vindicator's first true test. In the opening year of the conflict, Ilsa and an entire regiment of prized heavy mechs from the Red Lancers and Prefectorate Guard were killed fighting against the Federated Sons in an attempt to disrupt the hated, aggressive Davion staging areas. This disaster not only diminished the CCAF's precious dwindling heavy mech capacity, but it also placed the Confederation in a situation where it lacked the true, powerful reserves to deliver decisive counterblows to any Davion advance. And the AFFS after this victory did advance, and ruthlessly so. The new Chancellor, Liao, daughter of Ilsa, was placed into the horrible circumstances of simply watching her nation begin to be steamrolled by the Federated Sons, who were advancing all along her borders. And it was under this threat that the Vindicator played a key role in saving the most precious military-industrial site within the Confederation. Because in 2832, their impossibly powerful enemy continued to roll forwards, striking at the very heart of their industries. Their main target, their key objective, was the planet of Tikhonov, which also notably was the capital of a commonality of the same name. For House Davion, this was known as Operation Lion. For the Confederation, it became known as the First Battle of Tikhonov. This high-stakes battle determined the future of the Confederation and House Liao. A loss here could have seen the cascading collapse of the nation. The first major employment of a large volume of the now deceased Lisa Liao's doctrinal mech, the Vindicator, took place here when the CCAF confronted the Davion advance. The Fedsun flotilla that entered the system on April 4th overwhelmed the local recharge station, though the Liao soldiers defending it sold their lives with grim determination to buy time for their people within the rest of the system. 2 Capellan warships had to emergency detach from the station as well, damaging the docking ports on the facility. These 2 ships even caught somewhat flat-footed, complicated the Davion assault. The Davions knew they had no time to waste, regardless of these dangerous vessels hanging in the void. The assault on the recharge station took place even as their transports were targeted and destroyed by the warship's guns. 2 Davion transports were shot out of the void before their own escorts managed to bring enough fire to bear to drive the warships off. One of these vessels was so badly mauled by the fighting, the Jiajing, that it was forced to be scuttled by her crew shortly after the battle concluded. The Zhaoqing continued to be a thorn in the side of the Davion aggressors for the rest of their campaign on the planet. General H.R. Howler, Greer, led the primary army which was to take Tikhonov, with the 2nd Seti Hussars, RCT, being under his command. Well-trained and adept at mobile warfare, and exploiting their equipment advantage, they swept over most of the planet's defenses. One primary issue for Greer and his men here, though, was that his forces were adept at lightning strikes, and not at long, protracted battles. Greer hadn't completely destroyed the defenders as he'd taken much of the surface of the planet, you see, and now he had to size up his own forces against the Arenia Fusiliers, who'd withdrawn to the High Kremlin, a Star League fortress, as well as other natural and pre-prepared fortifications across the planet. The defenders could not break out of their forts, but the Seti Hussars' attempts to break in, or to even wear down the structure by artillery, were pointless. 6 months after this standoff began, even as starvation seemed to be beginning to take hold for the defenders, salvation arrived for the CCAF as the Chesterton Reserves arrived on October 19th to relieve the planet. This new formation was primarily comprised of Vindicator medium battlemechs, as well as captured Davion-built heavier battlemechs from across the front, including heavy mechs such as the Marauder. Catching the Seti Hussars out of place, what battles did take place showed the real value of the Vindicator, as they quickly repulsed any Davion units that were put in a position to fight. Realizing that the AFFS's position was not tenable, and that they would be crushed between a hammer and an anvil, General Howler had to measure his options. Seeing that their position was now made impossible, the Seti Hussars withdrew. But this was only to be temporary. A setback, if you will. The Davions would not be denied their prize, and were not so easily dissuaded from a setback when they were so close to their objective. Rearming and returning with the 17th Avalon Hussars, as well as the 9th Deneb Light Cavalry, they launched Operation Leopard in early 2833. This time armed with much heavier artillery, and with significantly more powerful formations, the Davions struck like a hammer blow. The High Kremlin was devastated by enemy bombardments before being fully captured on May 20th, 2833, after 2 weeks of intense and ugly fighting. 2 weeks later, Krasnodar and Pskov were utterly crushed under the heel of the Davions' march across the planet. Capellan Mechwarriors and soldiers fought valiantly in their defense, but were unable to stop their numerically superior, more heavily equipped enemies. But this was not the end of the fighting. Remaining CCAF troops and mechs broke up into smaller units, occupying increasingly difficult locations for their enemies to bring them to battle, turning the planet quickly into a quagmire, and dividing the 3 enemy regiments into smaller and smaller units, picking off soldiers and mechs where they could. During this slow bloodletting, Capellan reinforcements arrived in system on June 13th, and they began striking Davion supply points wherever they could, grinding the entire enemy operation to a halt. Capellan troops appeared to be on the move even further, according to Davion military intelligence, and that meant that all 3 regiments were at risk. Greer, reluctantly, ordered the withdrawal once more. For this, he was publicly vilified before being sent on KP duty on New Syrtis. It ruined his career. The easily repaired, easily supplied, durable Vindicator was proving its worth as it was being put into the defense of Tikhonov in now 2 major engagements, keeping the materially inferior CCAF in the fight. But the fighting and dying were not over yet. The third assault on Tikhonov took place in April of 2834, this time being dubbed Operation Puma. This time, General Jessica Bassner took the lead with the Deneb 3rd Light Cavalry. Mercenaries were also brought in to try to resolve this repeated failure on the part of the armed forces of the Federated Sons, but the final component of this attack was intended to be even deadlier, in the form of the 2nd Davion Guards, who would arrive after the taking of the planet to finally stop any attempt by the Capellans to dig in, or to counterattack the planet after their success. This time, the Davions truly had defeated the defending CCF forces outside of Tikhograd, which was a massive fortress of civilian sector buildings from the era before the Battlemech. Operation Puma, though, despite appearing successful, was already a failure. Once more, Capellan pockets of resistance began to raid the occupying supply lines, and a massive response was being formed by the Confederation to strike back at this location. Worse still, the 2nd Davion Guards never showed up, being pulled into a battle with the Draconis Combine instead. Now, the Deneb Light Cavalry and their mercenary allies could expect no relief when the enemy came to reclaim what was theirs. Instead of holding out, as the First Prince had wanted Greer to do, with the crisis emerging on the Draconis front, reluctantly and with frustration, he ordered the withdrawal of all forces on Tikhonov. Only this was far from clean. McCormack's Fusiliers and the Northwind Highlanders broke through the orbital cordon around the world and made planetfall. 3 hard days of fighting followed, as Capellan forces, which were increasingly Vindicator-centric, just as before, crashed into the scurrying Federated troops as they tried to make their escape. Their mercenary component was annihilated, and the Deneb Light Cavalry didn't escape unscathed either. The inability to take Tikhonov after years of work was beyond disappointing for Davion High Command, as well as for the First Prince, and in no small part, the victory across these 3 intense battles can be laid at the feet of the humble, yet innovative Vindicator. Its performance was exceptional in the roles it was required to fill, because it is better to have a mech on hand than not, and it is better to have them in meaningful enough numbers that they can replace lost forces. Tikhonov was a brutal campaign for both sides, but the flag of the Confederation hung over the planet for almost 200 years after these battles were waged, and all of this was but a slice of the Second Succession War for the Confederation. The war raged for decades more, destroying many of the advanced industries that remained within the country, as well as the remnants of their, and everyone else's, warship fleets. Only a few years after the end of the Second War, the long grinding Third Succession War opened up, and increasingly, the Vindicator became more and more prominent within the Capellan Confederation armed forces. Chancellors, the Celestial Wisdom, changed, but few alterations were made to the staple, the true workhorse of the Confederation. But having an army so dependent on one machine, and one form of warfare, creates new problems. And while the Celestial Wisdom saw just how important the Vindicator was to the survival of the nation for 2 centuries to come, things would have to change. And the Vindicator would have to change along with it. If it didn't, and if the Confederation itself didn't, then the realm faced certain doom. A medium Battlemech weighing in at 45 tons, the VND-1R Vindicator was not at first glance a revolutionary design upon its introduction, but in reality, it is one of the most important military machines in human history. It was the backbone of the Capellan army for over 200 years. This one, easily manufactured Battlemech became the ultimate fill-in machine for almost any combat lance in the entire arsenal of House Liao. Whether it be frontline fighting, garrison duty, or anything outside of recon, this humble machine has some ability to participate in it, especially when employed in some numbers. So, What exactly made this Introtech medium mech such a war winner? When it comes to its basic components, there isn't much that deviate from most other mechs of the time. It has a 4.5-ton Karsplex 4 chassis, or internal structure. It also has a standard gyro and cockpit, as you would expect. Cooling is incredibly important, as the mech's weapon systems are mostly energy dependent, and a large volume of space, for the overall size of the VND-1R, is allocated to this function. It has 6 tons of single heatsinks added overall, giving it the ability to vent 16 heat per turn, which is excellent when measured up to its offensive package. For onboard electronics, the Vindicator has the Carscom Model 21R communications package, and a C-Apple Churchill targeting and tracking system. In terms of advanced rules, it suffers from the difficult-to-eject quirk, though it benefits from the rugged trait. To survive, most medium mechs lean heavily into mobility in order to keep mechs competitive against heavier adversaries. And as strange as it sounds, the 1R does not really do this at all. As a trooper mech, its only real requirement was to move at the standard rate of inner-sphere battle line formations, and thus, the cost per unit of the Vindicator was dramatically lowered by not needing to install a particularly large engine. So, this resulted in the base Vindicator being powered by a 7-ton GM180 standard fusion power plant, which lets it move up to 64 kilometers per hour, or 6 movement points in the tabletop game. It's not fast, and it's not slow, at least in terms of general Battlemech statistics, not counting pure medium mechs. It also benefits from being able to jump up to 120 meters. This translates into 4 movement points, by the way. The jump jets help the mech with difficult terrain in order to better position itself in both offensive and defensive operations. While the Vindicator is unlikely to flank enemy formations individually due to its mobility profile, it's still quick enough to be adaptable on the battlefield. It's a true trooper, and the limitations of its movement reflect this. Introductory technologies really limit what can be done for defensive attributes. There are no forms of active defense, or even electronic protections in this state. The only means of hardening a vehicle is through the application and installation of standard armored plating. And this is very much the path the Vindicator went down. There is something that does make the VND series noteworthy in this case though, which is that it is extremely well guarded for its size. Care's designers opted to slather the mech in 9 tons of Starshield armor, giving it 144 points of armored protection. This is just shy of what many 60-ton heavy mechs are equipped with, and in fact, this is more than some machines in the lower end of the heavy tonnage bracket at that. This makes the Vindicator extremely hardy and durable in combat, allowing it to square off with materially superior foes, and making it an excellent anvil to break enemy formations on. As far as production goes, too, this form of plating is not even particularly expensive, meaning that it's not a barrier to production in the slightest. So, to summarize, the 1R is extremely well protected for its era of production. When it comes to its offense, the Vindicator is deceptively well armed. Often medium mechs from the post-Star League era have a tendency to have severe flaws with their weapons packages, but it's hard to say that for the Vindicator. It is very simple and straightforward in its design. First, if it's firing its weapons in their intended brackets, it is almost impossible to truly overheat. One could be engaging multiple targets at multiple ranges and perhaps begin driving into the red, but overall, it's very difficult to do so. This is because its heat budget of 16 is extremely robust. Now, with that out of the way, let's go over how by showing you just how gunned the Vindicator is. In the right arm, it has a Carsarm Smasher particle projection cannon, which hits very hard, breaking through armored plating on medium and heavy mechs and generating 10 points of heat. It also has a very solid range. Next up, it has a Cyan/Cares Jaguar LRM missile system mounted into the left torso, otherwise known as an LRM-5. This has 1 ton of ammunition. Normally LRMs do scatter damage, but LRM-5s do not. It's just there to complement the PPC at long range. or to fire indirectly to harass targets. After this, it has a head-installed Kara's Arms medium laser, which is great for short-range engagements, and is also positioned to allow the Vindicator to continue to fight, even if both of its side torsos are removed. Finally, it has a left arm-equipped Hessen small laser for in-close engagements, mainly as a backup. The PPC pairs well with each system barring the small laser. At medium range, it links with the medium laser. At long range, it links with the LRM, and neither will drive it into a thermal debt unless the mech jumps. And in both instances, that debt will be very minimal and can be incurred for multiple turns. It has a balanced offering as a platform, and this syncs perfectly with its generalist role. From direct fire support to general trooper activities, the Vindicator can pull it all off, because of its weapons package. The Vindicator isn't a spectacular runner. It's not an armored brick of a heavy mech. It's not the most perfectly gunned. But that doesn't truthfully matter. The Vindicator is a Battlemech that can do multiple jobs somewhat competently, and it has many true strengths. It's heavily armored. It is not obstructed by difficult terrain conditions. It is adequately and smartly gunned. Most importantly of all, it is cheap. It is also easily producible in large numbers, and complements itself extremely well by being deployed in massive formations, effectively allowing multiple Vindicators, to some degree, to act as a force multiplier to themselves when they are used in coordination with one another. This is what a real war machine looks like, in that it is designed for practical purposes and the grim realities of intense industrial warfare. It is not unfair to credit it with the longevity of the Capellan Confederation. As strange as it sounds, this primitive mech would be competitive when deployed, as it was designed for decades past its obsolescence in the 31st century, and that is a testament to its real value. To be so naive as to think that one can simply change a mech without any real plan to do so. The VND-1AA was a supposed upgrade created by the Capellan Confederation in 2863 in order to improve the mech's speed and maneuverability. This typically means reducing a mech's offensive package in some way, or its armor, or some combination of the two, in order to offset the tonnage of a heavier engine. Now, to be clear, mobility is a major attribute to indulge, but a mech must be optimized to exploit this correctly. The Avenging Angel was not, and reflected none of the wise decision-making behind the original model. The mech's engine was increased to a 225 fusion standard power plant, and it increased its jump capacity too. This made the mech move at 86 kilometers per hour, and it was able to leap up to 150 meters. Sounds great. Every single ton for this was taken from the mech's armor value. It retained all of the Vindicator's original heatsinks and armaments. It has 4.5 tons of armor though, giving it the same protection one would expect from a 20-ton Battlemech, and this would lead to predictable endings for this mech and its pilots. Eventually, in the 31st century, the Confederation gave the last of these death traps away, for free no less, to the new Free Rosslag Republic, as a gift, because they were truly that badly crafted. They weren't even worth keeping. The Succession Wars left the entirety of the Inner Sphere in a state of absolute ruin. But industrially, more than any other nation, the Capellan Confederation was left in a condition that could only be described as disastrous. while all the other great houses had been reduced, militarily, to technology seen in the late Age of War, losing essentially all of their advanced components, they were still able to produce mechs and other war machines in a wide array of sizes. Before the first two succession wars were done, the Confederation's ability to build heavier mechs hadn't just dwindled, it almost entirely vanished. They'd lost key worlds, or those planets had been bombarded to such an extent that they could only manufacture components of some of these heavier designs, but not the full range of parts to actually piece them all together. Indeed, so desperate were they for dedicated assault mechs, they procured chargers from the Draconis Combine, after the formation of the Capellan Accords, in order to rebuild them from the ground up for frontline combat service. These mechs were some of the most expensive assault mechs ever built during the Succession Wars, at least financially, as a result. Another example of their intense need was their Highlander restoration facility, where they had the ability to refurbish these long-destroyed mechs to bring them back into frontline service, though they lacked the ability to actually build the mech from scratch. Swapping and refurbishing parts is much easier than actually manufacturing it all yourself, it turns out. Their heavy mech forces by the late Third Succession War, in fact, were increasingly only comprised of salvaged machines from their enemies, outside of a few examples such as those given before. To give a fuller perspective of the depth of these privations, the Taurian Concordat, a region which was comparatively backwards technologically and economically in comparison to successor states like the Capellan Confederation, was able to build heavy mechs like the Thunderbolt or even the Marauder in limited numbers, something which the once mighty Confederation was no longer able to do. All of this meant that what had once been a stopgap, a filler for the Capellan Confederation armed forces, had evolved into its beating heart, the very essence of their military and their military's doctrines. The VND-1R, almost unchanged from its implementation almost 2 centuries prior, was now the front and center battlemech for their armed forces. Strength came from their numbers, versatility came from their ability to perform multiple missions, endurance came from their reliability. Much as Liao had planned centuries prior, the celestial wisdom had provided for the people of the Confederation through the concept of this mech, and their seemingly far-sighted vision for the situation they would now find themselves in. Tragically, this was not to be forever, as despite the strengths the Vindicator provided, it was about to be tested as never before. And this test of strength came about due to the folly of the latest incarnation of the celestial wisdom. The myth of House Liao's power was shattered through their own missteps, and the willingness of their Davion neighbors to enact vicious vengeance, even if that revenge mostly took on the form of millions of innocent people being destroyed. Chancellor Maximilian Liao is perhaps one of the most despised men in the history of the Inner Sphere. A manipulator by nature, he offset his enemies on all sides, forcing his foes to turn on one another. He played a key role in stoking the Free Worlds League civil war, and attempted to do the same within the Federated Sons, through his connections with the eventually disgraced Duke Michael Hasek Davion. This was not fully successful within the Sons, despite coming close. Prior to and during their attempts to turn the Capellan March to their cause, during the last years of the Third Succession War, they had also attempted to replace First Prince Hans Davion with a body double. These attempts to subvert the Federated Sons and destroy them on behalf of the Confederation, even if done during a time of war, created more than just a bit of resentment between the two sides. First Prince Hans Davion, naturally, took these provocations quite personally, and had every intention of revenging himself upon his Capellan rival, Maximilian Liao. When he shot from his seat, I thought he was going to launch straight away for his jump ship. He croaked a couple of times, then clutched his dessert plate to his chest as though it were solid gold. Then he started shouting at his wife and daughters to gather up the plates because they're military intelligence. "They show what worlds he means to conquer," Max bellowed. "I hope the Liao defenses are more organized than their leader." Colonel Morgan Kell's recounting of Max Liao's response to Hans Davion's gift to his wife, Melissa Steiner. Terra, 21st of August, 3028. The Fourth Succession War was launched by the Federated Sons and Lyran Commonwealth on the very wedding day of Hans Davion and Melissa Steiner, in 3028. What unfolded was a catastrophic collapse for House Liao. Maximilian Liao had joined the Capellan Accord in the years leading up to the Fourth Succession War, a defense and cooperation agreement comprised of the Free Worlds League, Capellan Confederation, and Draconis Combine, and in theory it was intended to help guard them from their long-standing enemies' aggression. Unfortunately for the Capellan state, Maximilian Liao had been the fifth wheel in the alliance, and almost certainly was an unwanted participant by one of the true cornerstones of this makeshift power block. Janos Marik, the Captain General of the Free Worlds League, held an enormous amount of contempt and scorn for his Capellan rival, knowing what he'd done to his realm in the years prior to the war, namely Max Liao's involvement in fostering the advancement of the Free World Civil War. A war where Janos was forced to kill one of his own children, who had been backed by Maximilian Liao and his lies. This meant that the Free Worlds League would not be forthcoming with support in the way an ally would be expected to in the war, only further complicating the situation for House Liao and giving them a false sense of security. The Sarna and Tikhonov commonalities were the first things to be struck by Operation Rat, the attack launched against the weakest of the successor states. The swiftness of the strike shattered the defensive front lines of the CCAF locally before war had even been declared properly. The overwhelming force put on display by House Davion in the new war, focusing their highly professional, better equipped military against their neighbor, was astounding. The Confederation appeared almost helpless in the face of the brutal advance. Vindicators were the most common line Battlemech in the CCAF, though it had many other stablemates in the army. But that mattered very little. Tactically and tragically, the Vindicators' value came often from being able to outnumber heavier foes. And now, on the battlefields of the Fourth Succession War, these mechs were heavily outnumbered by their AFFS counterparts. The Davions flooded war zones with better trained troops, in equivalent mechs to the Vindicator, like the Centurion or Enforcer, or worse, they outnumbered them still with heavier assets. Most often, a single Capellan professional battalion found itself facing off against a full professional Davion regiment. Wherever and whenever the Capellans managed to deploy a regiment, often their Davion opponents brought once more threefold their number. The era of stalemates from the Third Succession War was over. Decisive battles had finally returned, and it was an era of warfare that the Vindicator and its CCAF operators were not prepared for. The mech that had been ushered in during the Second Succession War to fill many gaps in their roster was now the anchor to the roster itself, and an anchor in more ways than one. Not every engagement with both sides was of course this lopsided, but in almost all instances, Davion forces had the initiative, while the Liao defenders had to scramble to even respond to attacks that flooded their systems across two full commonalities. Even the walls of Tikhonov, which had held against the Davions since the Second Succession War, failed, finally seeing this mighty citadel fall. The Federated Sons' advance was almost impossible to stop, and made worse by yet more personal betrayals behind the scenes. Justin Allard, a trusted defector from the Federated Sons who rose to the absolute heights of the Capellan intelligence community, had been a double agent, and worse, had betrayed the Chancellor during this disastrous war, having helped eat away at his nation's capabilities during the opening of the conflict. But that was not even the greatest humiliation he delivered, as Maximilian's daughter and heir apparent, Candace, then went on to elope with him, The pair formed a Federated Sons client state out of the wreckage of the St. Ives Commonality, now known as the St. Ives Compact, pulling it out of the shattered remnants of the Confederation's easternmost regions. This new nation would face resistance, both from within and without during its formation, but form it would, with Candace maintaining her grip on power. Notably, Candace Liao was known for piloting a Vindicator, ironically enough. Abandoned by his allies, his capital raided during the fighting, his industrial base broken, the loss of 3 commonalities, including the Confederation's most prized ones, and the end of Capellan prestige was, frankly, too much for Maximilian Liao to bear. He rescinded from public view, and his only remaining daughter, Romano, took on the responsibilities of his office. By 3036, she would officially take the title of Chancellor with her father's death. A death that clearly had nothing to do with Romano herself whatsoever, of course. Purges were enacted before this to ensure the iron grip of the beleaguered leadership, for fear of a loss of power to go along with the loss of prestige. The Fourth Succession War exposed the CCAF as a paper tiger. It had created an alternative regime to the core Liao family in the St. Ives Compact, and had seemingly forever broken the power of House Liao itself. This once great house seemed destined to become a mere paranoid rump state. The Vindicator itself finally broke as well. What had once been the true guardian of the state, the legacy of the celestial wisdom in many ways, and the ultimate warrior of an underdog, was now simply an old relic. One which would be updated with new technologies in the latter portions of Romano's rule as well. But it was a relic from the past still, even with these upgrades. Now it lingered, much like the half-dead nation it came from. The time of the Vindicator seemed almost to come to a close. And this would only accelerate too, in the years that followed. The freed St. Ives Compact had its own, independent spin on the Vindicator in the form of the VND-1 SCIC. The concept of the mech, though, came from one Mechwarrior Michael Jones, who had sided with Candace Liao during the split. The mech changes little, but what it does alter, in truth, is significant. Most of the configuration is the same as the original 1R, including its movement profile and armor. It does drop one heatsink, however. After this, the mech ditches its LRM-5 and PPC, replacing them with an LRM-10 with 1 ton of ammunition and a large laser. It also retains the original small laser and medium laser from the first design. This makes the Vindicator a much closer direct match to the Centurion from the Federated Sons, while keeping its jump capabilities. Overall, this is a solid alteration to the original. It loses some hole-punching power, but in favor of flexibility and greater overall damage output. The large laser also doesn't have a minimum range, and pairs better with its other close-in systems. It is a worthy series of trade-offs, improving in some ways on an already reliable and functional design. The Capellan Confederation did not partake in a meaningful sense in the clan invasion. In fact, Romano Liao herself appears to have at one point, perhaps sincerely, not believed it was taking place at all, despite the invasion of her allies, the Draconis Combine. With Star League technologies becoming increasingly available to everyone, and being able to be manufactured for the first time in centuries, it became time to reinvigorate the aging design of the Vindicator, at least in the eyes of the Confederation. The conclusion of this line of thinking is the VND-3L, and this design goes on to prove that the Confederation should be very grateful that they were not on the front lines of the invasion. This is not to say that the 3L is any worse than many other designs from this early era of reintroduction of powerful technologies. In some senses, it even makes some smart decisions. It just doesn't spend its tonnage as wisely as it should, and limits its battlefield functionality as a result. Viewed as a direct successor to the 1R, its designers were far from ambitious. Double heatsinks swap out its original singles, and it has a total of 15 of them, letting it vent up to 30 per turn. This makes this particular Vindicator oversynced. Now, oversyncing isn't always bad, but if it comes at the expense of the basic weapons package, to a meaningful extent, it can't really be viewed as great. It retains the original's movement profile and armor, much as the one SCIC did as well. In terms of weaponry, the 3L replaces the original PPC for an ER PPC. The LRM-5 is retained with the original complement of ammunition, and that ammunition is now supported by a case system. The ammo is put in the right torso, because of course, losing one's ammo should deprive the mech of its main systems as well, for the celestial wisdom demands it. Finally, it replaces out the medium laser and small laser to mount a medium pulse laser in the head. Overall, the 3L for its era of combat is a slow-moving mech, considering the advancements made by its peer competitors at the time and only a few years later. It is also relatively poorly gunned and oversynced, when it truly does desperately need more firepower to sustain it. The main attributes that don't let it down are its cheap cost, and its heavy armor for its weight. However, in the age of the clan invasion, this frankly isn't particularly impressive. It is clear to see why the Vindicator's star began to fade after the Forced Succession War. In fact, even at home, such was the level of mediocrity of this particular upgrade, that for the first time in centuries, the Vindicator's future, even, may have fallen into question. This Justin Shang betrayed the kindness the Liao showed him. He seduced the weakest of the Liao and carried Candace off to his lord's domain, robbing the Liao of their beloved St. Ives. And one day this treachery will be avenged. This treachery has, this day, been avenged. A martyr in service of the Liao succeeded in exacting retribution for Justin Shang's foul treason. He and his bitch lie dead on New Avalon, where they foolishly believed themselves safe from my wrath. Part of the declaration from Chancellor Romano Liao, after what she believed was a successful assassination of her sister and brother-in-law, Cyan, the Capellan Confederation, the 5th of January, 3052. When the Davions launched their war of aggression against the Capellan Confederation in 3028, surprising the totality of the Inner Sphere, few could have predicted it would be so overwhelmingly successful. Using strategic mobility to their advantage, the Davions outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outplayed the Capellans at every turn. But it's not the campaign itself that is remarkable, but the aftermath. Because no successor state in history was wounded, as House Liao was wounded, by a war such as this. Throughout the succession wars, the borders of the Confederation had indeed shrunk, being chipped away by Marik and Davion for centuries. But this was all piecemeal. Over time, yes, the Confederation had lost an enormous amount of territory, and by 3025, it'd been at its lowest point. What happened in the face of the Davions' onslaught, though, by contrast, can only be described as a total collapse. Half of the Liao's empire was lost in mere months, not in decades or centuries. To the eyes of everyone in the Inner Sphere, the Confederation had been mortally wounded. Worse still, it seemed to be continuing to erode, rapidly, as the celestial wisdom lost power. Romano staunched the bleeding by seizing control. In fact, For all the controversy as well as the historic viciousness that had been attributed to her and her reign, she is the only one who truly saved the Capellan state from total annihilation. Had it not been for her, Atreus and New Avalon would be the primary governing bodies reigning over all the former Liao Empire. She stabilized the nation's borders, winning important short campaigns, and showing the rest of the Inner Sphere that her nation was a porcupine to anyone that made a move against it. To achieve this, though, much was demanded from the people. Consumer goods were all but obliterated, as the state moved entirely to a permanent war footing in order to replenish its armies. Enormous volumes of private property owned by individual citizens was overtly seized as well. Any dissent was crushed ruthlessly. All meaningful political opposition was obliterated. This, in the short term, bore fruit, as most probing attacks against the state by either the Federated Commonwealth or the Free Worlds League were rebuffed by the recovering and bitter forces of House Liao. In the 2 decades after her rule, the state entered into a new level of paranoia and hostility with all of its neighbors, even its supposed allies, who left it to the unkind mercies of Hans Davion's brilliant strikes into their realm. Kara's metal industries almost fell to the Federated Commonwealth too during the wars, going from an insulated stronghold of House Liao to a corporation on a border world next to the Sarna March. Unsurprisingly, this was not the worst time for the Vindicator. While the Mech had been outclassed, and the military that wielded it had been shattered, what was the primary mech that could be used to replenish the now depleted arsenals of the CCAF? The only mech that could be built at scale as a line mech was still the Vindicator. Even as the Cataphract came back online, beginning to see production once more in the decades following the loss of Tikhonov, this was simply the main option for the army to employ in numbers within the recovering military. It is important to note that this almost stasis-like condition was not to last forever. Romano Liao attempted to murder her sister Candace, the leader of the St. Ives Compact, as well as her husband, the arch-traitor Justin Allard, largely out of spite. She succeeded in killing Justin, but failed to kill Candace. Failing to eliminate the latter was to have consequences. As it turns out, vengeance is a two-way street, especially if you fail to enact it. And Romano, in turn, faced the same fate, with her and her consort Sen Shang being killed in turn, by Candace herself no less, in 3052. The leadership of the nation being lost did not, however, cause a collapse, as her eldest child, Sun Tzu, took on the title of Chancellor, without contest, after her departure. And it was this figure that changed the fortunes of the Confederation forever. With this rule came a renaissance for the once-defunct nation, hanging on the edge of annihilation. Private ownership of property was restored, and those that suffered severely from this policy were compensated where possible, for starters. This loosened the iron grip that the state had taken in economics in order to filter everything into military production. The reality was, Sun Tzu knew, not only from his own intuition, but from his advisors, that growing the economy overall would be more important than filtering everything down a narrow path. The military could prosper from that growth overall. Such measures as nationalizing every element of the economy might be helpful in a short-term crisis, but it killed the system that was required to keep the state going, and stifled the military long-term regardless. Sun Tzu demanded only the best from others, and himself, and put the interests of the state before himself in many instances, while expecting others to do the same. Sun Tzu was a combination of his mother's ruthlessness and his father's cunning, and for those near the celestial throne, there was finally hope. The feeling for the first time in decades was not misplaced. With the attention of the Inner Sphere being on the clans, and to a lesser extent the Federated Commonwealth as well, it gave the Confederation an opportunity to recover what had been lost, and emerge stronger than it had been since the early succession wars. In the years that followed, he would ally himself with the Free Worlds League, stringing along Thomas Marik with the promise of a marriage to his supposed daughter. From there, the Confederation would participate in Operation Bulldog to end the clan threat once and for all, and Sun Tzu himself became the first lord of the restored Star League. Later, he would arrange a triple alliance between the Confederation, Canopus, and the Taurian Concordat, and came to dominate the other two states. He used his position as First Lord of the Star League and his network of allies for his nation's gain, in order to subdue the rogue branch of his family, resulting in the reincorporation of the St. Ives Compact. That said nothing of further economic and social changes he had enacted, or even how he had helped build Canopus into a true partner for his nation. Eventually, he married into the Centrella family, solidifying the bond between the two realms for at least a generation. Finally, Sun Tzu helped engineer the collapse of the Sarna March, and ruthlessly began seizing the chaotic region, once a bastion of House Liao, largely for his empire once more, exploiting the weakness of the collapsing Federated Commonwealth as he did. The only thing is, the Vindicator was not to be part of many of these processes, at least not in nearly as meaningful of a way that it once would have been expected to. The industrial sites were expanded, and new designs and configurations were put forth for the CCAF. These new mechs and vehicles, built with innovative, experienced military know-how, and a know-how no longer being suppressed by fear of their superiors, led to wild new designs. These new competitors to the Vindicator vastly outpaced the now dated concept of the VND-3L. A good example is the SNK-1V Snake. This mech could do almost anything the Vindicator did, only it was faster and used more sophisticated weaponry. Another example was the Huron Warrior, which flatly outdid the Vindicator even more, and is one of the first near-sphere medium mechs to incorporate the mighty Gauss rifle in its design since the fall of the Star League. This further said nothing about the fact that the Confederation now began producing meaningful numbers of heavy mechs. Mechs like the Cataphract came to the fore, but so too did cutting-edge machines like the Thunder, a 70-ton brawler. Sadly for this Succession Wars veteran, the real, final death blow came once the Confederation acquired Omni technologies from their allies during the clan invasion. Kara's Metal Industries received license to produce the FS9O Firestarter. The Battlemech differed quite significantly from the original FS9 series of old. To start with, obviously, it was an Omnimech, and second of all, it was a 45-ton heavily guarded medium Battlemech. Being an Omnimech gave it the ability to be rearmed and re-equipped in quick order between engagements. Stunningly, this design proved to be so well suited to the demands of the CCAF, it functionally killed all demand for the Vindicator for domestic usage, shortly after its introduction in 3057. To run down its virtues, it moved 50% faster than the Vindicator, had the ability to leap 50% further, used double heatsinks, was more heavily armed in almost every one of its preset configurations, and was only slightly less armored. It was also, in short, superior in every meaningful way beyond cost. But now, the CCAF had the resources to simply buy better machines, and the FS9O was a wildly superior machine to its primary competitor in this weight bracket in space. That main competitor was the Vindicator. Vindicators went from being a necessary frontline mech to a backline replacement quite quickly, outside of a few specific, specialized variants that emerged after the defeat of the clans. Even then, the CCF diversified its range of mechs and exports further from this point regardless. Even if the Omnimech Firestarter hadn't slaughtered this sacred calf entirely, its time was now up as the premier Capellan frontline battlemech. War had moved on, and fast. What had once been a staple, one that had dominated centuries of warfare, now became either a garrison mech or a highly specialized machine. The dominance of the Vindicator even before 3060, was truly over. .3060 was the beginning of a new life for the Vindicator series, with the 5L. While not the most spectacular variant, it was at least specialized enough that it was no longer in competition with much more viable, cutting-edge mechs like the Snake or Firestarter O. It also retained many of the qualities that kept the Battlemech inexpensive, we'll say. Getting started, it has a standard gyro, cockpit, and internal structure. It also retains its traditional 180 fusion engine, for better or for worse. It dropped its cooling to a base of 10 double heat sinks too, in order to actually allow the mech to overheat on purpose. Why, may you ask? Because it has triple strength myomers, letting it run faster and hit harder in close. Oh, and by the way, it retains its original jump jets too. Then, as far as base components go, it has 9.5 tons of armor, giving it 152 armor pips. Where do things change, may you ask? Well, it uses an ER PPC in the right arm. Then it has a battery of lasers spread across its two side torsos. In each side it has an ER medium laser and a medium pulse laser. Where things change a little is in the right torso it has a small pulse laser, and in the left a standard small laser. All of these things are here to help it, deliberately, overheat on its way to attack opponents in close, because this mech also supports a melee weapon, which in this instance is a sword. When boosted by TSM, this sword can be quite effective at overwhelming enemy mechs. On top of that, its ER and pulse lasers do quite well in close too, helping offset some of the targeting heat penalties. In essence, the 5L is a relatively slow-moving melee fighter that has a ton of armor and can hit quite hard in close, especially if its TSM is timed correctly to let the mech move up a little bit faster. Its main problem? Even at higher speeds, it's still sluggish for its weight. And even if it's well guarded as a medium, in this era of warfare, facing the volume of fire both Intersphere and Clan mechs can dispatch, it can struggle to remain viable long enough to really engage its primary means of overcoming enemy mechs. Still, its defined role definitely bought the Vindicator a few years inside of the CCAF, as it declined in other spaces, up until 3060. Despite being designed and built in 3063, the VND-4L is truthfully the final evolution point of the Vindicator's original design. None have surpassed it since its development. It also begins to embrace futuristic warfare concepts that the CCAF would come to embody over the next century. Internally, it is radically different from the mech it is based upon, but its overall profile is simply just a major modernization and enhancement over the original, while being tasked with a new role, that of a stealth battlemech. First of all, it retains the original's internal structure, gyro, and cockpit, but this is really where things stop being similar. It upgrades its power plant to a 225XL engine, giving it a maximum speed of 86 km per hour. By this era of war, this is no longer considered fast, but it is at least serviceable, especially when combined with its specific defensive technologies. One of those technologies, by the way, is its case system, which sadly won't save the mech should its ammunition cook off, as it will likely destroy its side torso, disabling its XL engine. But it will save the pilot and much of the chassis. By the way, it can also leap up to 150 meters. It has 13 double heat sinks overall, letting it vent 26 heat per turn, which is very good for what its role is, and is definitely needed, because the VND-4L supports a new defensive armor type known as Stealth Armor. With 9 tons of the material, plus the required Guardian ECM, it is as protected as the original VND-1R, but when its armor is activated to its fullest form, which does consume additional heat, the VND-4L receives defensive bonuses at medium and long ranges for incoming enemy fire. It, in essence, becomes harder to hit. This means it can generate meaningful TMMs with its movement, or enhanced jump ability, making it incredibly difficult to pin down and seriously lay into, forcing enemy mechs to come into their short distance brackets if they want any hope of dealing with this mech. And deal with it they must, because the 4L also has an updated strike capacity, mirroring the 1R that they are going to have to contend with. In the right arm it uses an ERPPC, and once more it has a left torso mounted LRM-5, with of course its ammunition being once more mounted, that's right, in the right torso, because of course. An ER medium laser is then found in the center torso, and a medium pulse laser is installed in the head. In essence, this is a 1R with extended range, and some additional accuracy, but most importantly, it has the vital mobility it had required since the opening of the clan invasion. In addition, its stealth protection makes it formidable, and makes it a frustrating target to remove from the battlefield. The only problem? It's fairly costly in comparison to how these mechs were originally intended to be used. The 4L, while important, was never a real replacement for the large volume of Vindicators slowly being phased out for other machines. This is a stealth mech, and it has a very specific role to play. The last Vindicator of the 31st century to be put in production, the VND-6L is an attempt to merge the aspects of both the 4L and the 5L into a single chassis, though it, during its initial production run, was dependent on salvage from enemy forces in order to construct it as of 3068. These machines were apparently only rewarded to the most skilled and talented Vindicator pilots. I suspect many of them would have likely preferred if they remained in their 4Ls. Once more, it retains the basic components of the 1R. In addition to that, it retains its engine, going back to moving at 64 kilometers per hour, and having jump jets to leap up to 120. This is frankly extraordinarily inadequate, just as before, and only worse because the timeline has moved forward, though it now has stealth armor, which the 6L has 9.5 tons of. This does help offset some of these shortcomings. Once again, it has TSM, which can boost its speed under the right conditions. Still, it's a 45-ton mech that goes, on average, 64 kilometers per hour. I have to stress, in this era of warfare, that's bad. When it comes to heat sinks, it only has its base total. Finally, it has a targeting computer to make its onboard weaponry more accurate, and I suspect to also help it offset some of the heat penalties it will incur. So, with all of that out of the way, what is this thing armed with? Its main cannon in this instance is the ever-terrifying plasma rifle, which not only damages mechs, but causes them additional heat. Vehicles and infantry in particular just burn, which is very terrifying. This has 20 rounds of ammunition, more than enough for an extended engagement. In the right torso it has twin ER medium lasers. In the left torso it has twin single-shot Rocket 10 launchers, which are great for following up an attack at the right moment to deliver finishing blows on targets. Finally, it has a sword, which pairs well with its TSM. The real problem is, even with stealth armor, this mech is frankly slow, and very much dependent on TSM in order to move with any kind of significant haste. Even then, 86 kilometers per hour is not fast for a Battlemech, as standards by this time had gone up substantially. Despite attempting to marry the 5L and the 4L together in harmony, the 6L also takes on many of the problems the two mechs shared regardless. It doesn't really fix the problems of either, and just creates new problems for the Confederation to deal with. Do not let fear dominate you. We commit to you that little will change for you, day to day. The Star League respects your strength your wisdom, your skills, and you will have every opportunity to not only hone these gifts to perfection, but to be recognized and rewarded in a peaceful, secure, and safe new order. Your lives will be better, your families will live well, and this world will prosper. The Capellan Confederation stands for none of these values. If they win this war, this world, your livelihoods will be seized, your children chained, your people subjugated to the will of a mad tyrant. Remember the legacy of the Star League, and join us in building a new apex of humanity. The Third Star League's broadcast over the recently liberated world of Graham 4, May 3152. Much changed in the decades after the defeat of the clans and the collapse of the Federated Commonwealth. The word of Blake's holy war scourged the Inner Sphere before their destruction, and the Republic of the Sphere was established and pushed back at the center core of human space. Nations such as the Draconis Combine and Free Worlds League had attempted to resist this push by Devlin Stone's new state, but they failed in the face of their wrath, and their ambitions ended with his victory. One nation that never yielded in the face of such things, however, was the Capellan Confederation. Their long humiliation throughout the succession wars simply wouldn't allow for it, especially after their resurgence under the great Sun Tzu Liao, while others limited their military appropriations and their standing armies. The Confederation did no such thing. Any treaty they signed, they didn't honor, and it was very much known by everyone that it was not being honored. The main thing that kept them in check from simply rushing into a new war was that their new sworn enemy, the Republic of the Sphere, was allied with their old enemies. This created a balance of power in the Inner Sphere, and one where the Confederation, no matter how it tried, couldn't break the gridlock that this had caused. New leadership eventually came to the Confederation, even if under some dubious conditions, with Davion Liao taking on the role of Chancellor after his father's supposed passing. Davion, too, took on the great task of undermining and destroying the Republic, continuing his father's policies regarding rebuilding the CCAF. With the fall of the HPG network and the diplomatic crisis that the Republic and her allies entered into, Davion and the Confederation struck. Grand in scale were the size and scope of the Confederation's victories. The Federated Sons lost most of the Capellan March, including its capital of New Syrtis, to Davion's legions. Indeed, the CCAF seemed to have endless reserves and constantly rotated troops, despite fighting some of the best forces locally in both the Republic of the Sphere and the Federated Sons, all at once. The Confederation was a military juggernaut, a superpower, and through its ruthless campaigning, truly did the real work behind shoving the Republic into its grave. Clans Jade Falcon and Wolf were the ones to make it to Terra first, but the Republic was only in its critical situation due to the cunning and brutal blows delivered to it by the Confederation, who had truly set up the state for collapse. The real question all of you must be wondering, and that must be answered now, is, what role did the Vindicator play in all of this? How was it poised within the CCAF's expansion, bucking Republic edicts, and the eventual war? Very surprisingly, the VND series saw a resurgence in the final days of the Dark Age. Old models were refit and put back into service, and new ones were assembled on Capella, once more under Care's Metalworks. Their new cutting-edge model went beyond what could have been expected from House Liao, given their limited exposure to the clans, and that came in the form of a devastating clan weapon system, that being its Clantech ER PPC, which was acquired from Seafox merchants. This incarnation of the V&D series apparently proved its value in fighting along the Capellan March, as well as along the Confederation's border with the Free Worlds League. Clearly, this speaks volumes of the decline of quality in the fighting forces of the AFFS and FWLM, or perhaps speaks of the high quality of the CCAF's Mechwarriors by contrast, given what the 7L is, despite its new terrifying weapon. More importantly than doing well in these campaigns, however, these mechs were available in numbers for Davian's final push against the Republic, and spilled into the fighting around Terra in the aftermath of Alaric Ward's victory against Devil in Stone. The only problem is, this Vindicator, this excess in some ways, is reflective of the state of the Confederation now in the aftermath of Davian's failed campaign. What could have been an innovative, powerful medium mech was little better than an intro tech machine with a few bells and whistles strapped onto it. It was an old idea, just as assaulting Terra was an old idea. They'd pushed the design to its logical limit, but they'd not shifted or changed it into something new and viable. Long gone was the path of the VND-4L, a mech still viable in the latest era in many senses. Now was the return to the traditional 1R style. It was a full revision, a full step backwards in concept and completion. The CCAF and its warrior houses had also been driven as far as they could go. It had been the mightiest house in the Inner Sphere, one which restored most of its borders from earlier times. This was the restored military and nation, which had fought and defeated its traditional enemies on numerous occasions, and was now the house most responsible for the miserable death of the Republic of the Sphere. But it flamed out during the campaign to crush the Wolf Khanate and the Third Star League, and tasted defeat, true defeat, for its arrogance and folly. And the Vindicator 7L, perhaps, is reflective of that folly herself. Davion, the Celestial Wisdom, is now dead, killed by Clan Wolf's allies, the Snow Ravens. The CCAF has been repulsed from their campaign to reign over Terra. Dramatically, their allies in Endurian and the Magistracy of Canopus have also turned their backs on them in those most vital of times, with the two also beginning the process, seemingly, of actively betraying their masters on Cyan. The Vindicator, put into the spotlight once more, returning to prominence inside of the military, has proven to once more be a paper tiger, and especially so against sophisticated and well-designed clan battlemechs. Now the Confederation is on the back foot, truly for the first time in generations. Now they must relearn what they'd so arrogantly tossed away before. Now the CCAF and warrior houses must adapt. Now the Vindicator must finally evolve, truly, into something new, lest it once more be cast into the dustbin of history, perhaps along with its masters. A refresh of a Battlemech with a legendary pedigree, even if it had some odd choices throughout the latter half of the 31st century, the VND-7L was clearly intended for it to be a return to form. It is in reality a boondoggle born of 3147, at least in the eyes of this enthusiast. Instead of being a real breakthrough in design, it is the embodiment of Inner Sphere succession war thinking, and only in the worst ways. It fundamentally doesn't address the changes to combat that have been seen in the Inner Sphere since the clan invasion, stubbornly clinging to poor ideas that simply make it less desirable to field. It is plagued by an even more intense version of the thinking that made the mech rescind from common use after the clan invasion, notably barring the VND-4L. It discards what few lessons seem to have been learned by this era of mech design. So, let us look at Davian's true folly, the Vindicator 7L, and begin that with some of its internal components. One of the new technologies on board is in its very bones, in its reinforced internal structure, which is not inherently a bad thing, sort of. This is a 9-ton attribute, twice as much as the standard internal structure, but it in essence can absorb 2 points of damage per internal structure pip. It also reduces the chances of enemy mechs scoring a critical hit by 1. Sounds great, doesn't it? Losing multiple tons of weight will have no drawbacks to any other systems on board, clearly. The mech does keep relatively cool with its 12 double heat sinks on board, as a quick aside. Basically, it can expel 24 points of heat per turn, and it will need it if it finds itself, God forbid, in a real engagement, because this thing is not made for a real fight. The 7L has a standard gyro and cockpit, as there was no need to make alterations to these, and I suspect no tonnage either. In terms of what is meant to keep it alive, the 7L is enhanced by a Case 2 system for its ammunition. This helps it avoid a case of instant destruction from a major ammunition explosion. This Vindicator then goes on to install heavy ferrofibrous armor plating as its primary method of protection, and it has 8 tons of it, once more making the mech very hardy, giving it 153 points of armor. And oh boy does this thing need to be hardy, as it exists to be punched in the face. Because, in an era filled with Gauss rifles, LBX autocannons, Clantech ERPPCs, pulse lasers of varying qualities, including clan ones, and with just general weapons with very long sets of range brackets, the designers at Kara Metalworks decided that in the Ilclan era, it would be wise to build a 45-ton medium mech with a 180 standard fusion engine, the original Vindicators. You know, the VND-1Rs. The 180 fusion engine from that mech, meaning that this machine only goes 64 kilometers per hour, and it leaps up to 120 meters. For those of you who are a little bit more in tune with what that means, it's a 464 mech that weighs 45 tons in the Ilclan era. I'm just going to let that settle in for a moment. Worst of all, they give it a big enough gun that it cannot be ignored, meaning that it becomes a bullet magnet. Now, you may think that is desirable. The concept behind having a unit designed for distraction is not an old one. And after all, the mech does have a lot of armor. It's got a reinforced structure. What could go wrong? The answer to that is everything. It's too slow to avoid fire. It has decent armor, which will erode fast under the kind of firepower seen in the post-clan invasion world. Then, it has more internal structure, but this just means the mech will be crit to death, even with the -1 to crit rolls. The destiny of this mech is to be badly mauled by anything faster than it, or anything more heavily armed and armored than it. This thing is beyond a turkey, and worse, it's not even particularly cheap, with it coming in with a battle value close to 1600. So, let us now go over its overwhelming weapons package that will allow it to simply wipe away its enemies. It has a Clantech ERPPC. It's a great weapon. Would be even greater if the mech could, adequately protect itself. This is a fantastic system and an immediate threat to 99% of Battlemechs on the table, either punching holes in enemies at range, or even clipping their heads clean off. After this, it has an LRM-5 installed, much like the original. It also has a head-mounted ER medium laser, and finally a left arm-mounted small X pulse laser. Everything barring its ERPPC is pretty much a backup in some form. So yes, this Vindicator is slow. It is 45 tons. It has a lot of armor for its weight, and it has a cannon that more or less ensures that it has to be removed. Even an XL engine would have been a boon to this model to just try to keep it from attracting too much enemy fire. Contrasting it with powerful mechs like the Hammerhead, which are in the same weight range and concept, which despite using a few more clan components, has just a strong construction idea at the mech's core, and it shows this particular Vindicator to truly be a tin god, just as its makers in this new era. It is wholly dependent, once more, on simply being in the superior position in either numbers or quality over their foes to achieve battlefield success. This is just like the VND-1R before, that can only hold until a real enemy manifests itself. The Vindicator 7L is tragically far too closely aligned to the arrogance and downfall of the Confederation in this latest era of warfare. With bronze as a mirror, one can correct one's appearance. With history as a mirror, one can understand the rise and fall of a state. With good men as a mirror, one can distinguish right and wrong. Li Shimin, Tang Emperor Taizong. The Vindicator emerged from desperation. Desperation to keep the nation together. Desperation to avoid submission to outside powers. In that, its formation and employment can be described as nothing but a staggering success. The Capellan Confederation exists today because of the Vindicator. Of that there can be almost no doubt. Without it, it'd have been forced to go into battle with machines far less suitable to its battlefield roles, and would have made their survival significantly less likely. But in its rise to prominence once more, first under Sun Tzu and then later under Davion, the Capellan Confederation simply grew past what the Vindicator was. Now, arguably more so, even after its latest variant's introduction in the late Dark Age and Ilclan eras. Warfare has truly left the Vindicator behind. While the VND 5L and 6L tried to carve a specific niche, even if it was perhaps somewhat misguided, it at least made a valuable role for the Mech to fulfill. The next true step in the machine's evolution, the 4L, adapting new technologies focusing on mobility and defense, was truly the path the Mech should have taken if they wanted it to retain mainstream use in the wars that emerged in the aftermath of the clan invasion. Instead, now, it has come to an evolutionary endpoint, in the form of the 7L. It simply doesn't work in the context of modernized warfare in the latest eras of fighting, where speed is essential both as a tool of offense and defense. There are assault mechs that move faster than this thing. Worst, it doesn't even adapt the stealth armor that previous models had come to rely on to attempt to bolster its combat effectiveness. Sadly, the VND-7L may reflect the current state of the Capellan Confederation in the years to come. Its return to importance within the CCAF really displays just the wrong-headed, arrogant thinking that commanders and procurement officers believed the army needed. They regressed from being a strong military built on innovative solutions, back into being an army dependent on numbers and the hope their opponents couldn't overmatch their sturdy medium machines. Such tactics are beyond lost in eras of mobile warfare, especially when their enemies can bring armies built of far heavier or far more adeptly constructed machines in equal or at least similar numbers to stare down these mismatched Capellan war assets. If the Vindicator in its current form represents the future of the Capellan Confederation, then it certainly is an uncertain one, if not a disastrous one. With the dramatic passing of Davion at the hands of the Wolf Khanate and her allies, that uncertainty only grows, with enemies now amassed across our borders, including the slow betrayal of its traditional allies, which it had grown to rely on. Much must be done to staunch the bleeding of what was once the great superpower of the Inner Sphere houses. While not as traumatic or gigantic of a failure as the sundering of the Confederation by Hans Davion, the scale and scope of its failure to take Terra has just begun to unfurl, as the army was driven back, and as the empire abroad falls apart. For at least 2 generations, the Confederation has broken the mold it'd been forced into for centuries, being a true giant amongst its peer houses. Ironically, with the return of the Vindicator to its traditional role, it appears that the Confederation is also now returning to the state it was in when it was first forged. The irony should be lost on no one. Will this be the fate of the Vindicator as well? Or will the Capellan Confederation and its leadership rally in the face of their failures? Will they reforge the nation? And ironically, the Vindicator, as Sun Tzu did a century prior. Is a new line of thinking needed? Is rebirth required once more? Only celestial wisdom knows such things, as only celestial wisdom will be able to guide them through this storm. Xing Sheng. Quiet. Her voice somehow carried over the sounds of the assault above. It took another few moments for her to realize that the crowd did in fact go quiet, and she could hear them going quiet. The explosions had ceased. She stood by the heavy steel door, breathing hard, tasting concrete dust and blood in her mouth. She wiped her chin, and her fingers came back red. A uniformed guard stepped forward in relative silence. "The Celestial Wisdom?" asked the guard. "Where?" Denai shook her head. "He's gone." A collective gasp went up from the gathered survivors. Locking his lips, the guard glanced back over his shoulder. Then he faced Denai, stood straight, and braced. "What are your orders, Chancellor?" First of all, I want to thank you all for joining me here today. If you enjoyed this video, I urge you to smash the like button. And if you're new here and enjoyed the ride, I'd recommend subscribing. It really does help. I hope this remaster is everything you'd hoped for, as we delved into just about every variant of the Vindicator, and some of the history around House Liao. Also, I want to give a massive shout out to all of the YouTube channel members who support me in making these projects. I literally could not do this without you guys. This content is really only made possible because of viewers like you. For those of you who are not members, if you would like to join their ranks to support this channel further, you can do so by hitting the join button. I also want to point out, yes, at the beginning of this video going forwards, there will be an indicator that these videos are not made by generative products. Nothing in the script, voice, or visual elements are part of these things. This is a human endeavor, just like Battletech itself. I'd actually like to stress that the slop being thrown onto the internet now, which is outpacing human creators, is genuinely bad for all of us. Not simply because it threatens human content creators, but because it's something slowly sucking the life out of us as human beings. All of us. I'll continue to make content as long as it is viable, of course. But just in general, I urge everyone to enjoy things crafted by real people. Enjoy things in the community and nature around you. Embrace that which is real, or at least that which is crafted by those who are real. I'll get off my soapbox now. I just wanted to share. This script took a little bit longer than usual for me to put together. I wasn't sure at several points just how deep I wanted to go into it, to be honest. But after I covered that, I moved over to general descriptions of events happening for the later eras, just because the Vindicator itself begins to lose its connection with the Confederation after 3050, until like the Ilclan era. And even then, I really didn't want to delve too deep into that, as despite reading through the sourcebooks of the era, and reading some of the novels, I still didn't feel I could really do all that material justice in the video, by just linking it to the Vindicator. Instead, I wanted to focus on when the Confederation returned to the Vindicator. It returned to its old status, which is basically what happened. As a quick aside, we're truly blessed with a great deal of new artwork of the Vindicator that is all official. And these are all related to various products that have come out. Everything from Battletech encounters to the current classic Battletech starter set, which I believe includes a Griffin and a Vindicator that square off against one another. These things are all currently available, and if you do want a Vindicator in plastic, Remember, it's in the starter set. I only tell you because, despite me being so hard on the later variants of the Vindicator, my favorite era to play in is the Succession Wars, and I love the Vindicator. I also want to give a big shout out at the end of this video to Marik, which I think is the right way to pronounce that, who has done a lot of the incredible songs that you will find in this video that are inspired by something with a little bit more of an Asian background. Just because I felt it was very fitting for that to be in the Vindicator. I've sat on this music actually for quite a while, and this felt like the perfect place to really display it. She has a great catalog, and I will include a link to her YouTube page in the top pinned comment, along with the other resources I used to make this video. And there is also, of course, several tracks from Scott Buckley as well, who does absolutely amazing work as well, and I will also have a link to his profile in the top pinned comment as well. So with all of that, what do you think of this Vindicator video? Did you enjoy the runover of its configurations? Have I been unfair to it? Which is your favorite Vindicator? Let me know in the comment section below, and I, of course, as usual, will catch you all there.